All right, we're at episode 11 of the SumerSports show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm the VP of Research and Development at SumerSports. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitrov, the CEO of SumerSports, and this is our first Monday podcast in the history of this series here. I'm really excited because we've dived into a few topics. We even had a guest last week. But I think what we've gotten, frankly, quite a bit of really good feedback. And so what I want to do with today, Thomas, is start a series where you and I sort of go back and forth on, sort of your expertise. So for people who aren't familiar, Thomas was the GM of the Atlanta Falcons for 12 years. And then prior to that, held various roles, scouting all the way up to executive roles with the Patriots and the Browns and the Detroit Lions. By the way, the Detroit Lions are surging right now. Restore the roar for the Detroit Lions. Obviously I had, as a director of analytics and all those things with Pro Football Focus, and obviously approach things a little bit differently than Thomas does. So what we want to do here for these Monday episodes is go over the process of evaluating players, both from Thomas's perspective and from my perspective as an analytics person. So I think this is exciting, Thomas. The welcome.
Well, look, to do twice a week, and we have a lot going on, so I love it. This is a little bit of a reprieve, right? Step back, talk about football. I have always really wanted to be in this situation, Eric, where we could talk about sort of juxtaposition our backgrounds and our careers and come together. You and I, this goes back to when you and I talked about, turn the world upside down a couple of years ago. I was still with the Falcons and I was talking to you about everything under the sun, how we could pull all of that unbelievable technology, information, intelligence, and experience and make it special. So maybe this is an opportunity to start digging into that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so enriching for somebody like me who is an outsider for sure. Like my background, I played football all through college. I was a tight end for a few years and so forth. But after that was done, I went to graduate school. I was a math professor forever. I've never scouted in my life. I did some grading for PFF, but not much. I will say that. And, so I'm completely, but I want to get your insight on how you go through this. And of course, like I've done player evals. I built the whole player projection system that folks that buy PFF IQ get. So I have a little bit of background in sort of trying to understand how to project from one place to the other. So I want to take a step back and say, okay, we're going to do one position every week. This I want to start with, and maybe I'm wrong. So this might be the first disagreement we have, but I want to start with what might be the easiest position to project, which is defensive end, like edge, basically. So you're talking about 4-3 defensive ends, 3-4 outside linebackers, kind of, that distinction used to be bigger, but now it's kind of, all the defenses kind of are in, nickel. And so you're basically a pass rusher when you play this position. So do you agree that edge is the easiest position? Let's start with that.
Well, it's funny. It may be like just really honing in on the player and watching the player. It may be fairly basic, but I think in the middle of all this, you could look up the misses on pass rushers is unbelievably high. Everyone goes on and on about the quarterbacks. Check it out over the last 10 to 15 years. Where the misses are on these DPRs, a lot of times we used to call them designated pass rushers. That's just the guy who can get around the corner, of course. Here's a really interesting thing before we start, because yes, I agree, purely watching, but why we're missing, and I was a part of two legitimate misses in Atlanta. One was Vic Beasley, and we can talk about that. Vic Beasley won the sack totals in the year we went to the Super Bowl, and then he plummeted. It's another story. And then Tack McKinley, both really, really good athletes, ability to get up and around the corner, ability to explode, et cetera, but they both fizzled, which has to do with something else involved in the evaluation of a D end and a pass rusher.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, from my perspective, so like when I think about like analytically, one of the reasons why it's easy is the market. I think, when you look at defensive ends that get second contracts, for the most part, now we've had situations that, Frank Clark for one, so on and so forth. But for the most part, like we do a pretty good job of ordering defensive ends when we look at second contracts. And a lot of times, it's because to be a good defensive end, to be a good pass rusher, you need to have two things. You need to have like otherworldly athleticism, right? So you need to be big and fast and strong. And you also need to be productive, right? And frankly, like I think this is where analytics has done a pretty good job, because we're now better at measuring production for defensive ends, right? We're it's not just sacks. Like I grew up watching the Minnesota Vikings, and you'd have Chris Dolman former Falcon would have 21.5 sacks one year and 7.5 the next. And you're just like, well, is that just noise? Like we've all seen guys miss sacks and stuff, but we're actually pretty good at that. But at the same time, from college to pro, it's really hard to divorce, some production, which could be faux production. You're facing easy tackles, you're facing offenses that are conducive to getting good pass rushers on. And so when you're looking at a defensive end in the college ranks, let's say, what's the first thing you're looking at as far as traits?
Let me just lead in by saying, think about this. Anyone out there who hasn't evaluated, always think about it when you're evaluating a player, snap to whistle. It's an interesting approach, because it allows you to keep consistency in every evaluation you may do. Let's just say in the position of DNs. So when you look at the DN on one side of the screen at University of Alabama, and then you look at the other guy because they have two studs, and you're truly looking at it from snap to whistle. The very first thing is explosiveness from off the ball, right? Mm-hmm. The snap off the ball explosiveness is the first thing. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, yeah. And when you look at explosiveness, it's obviously a thing where you're looking at like how fast they come off the ball contextually, though, right? Because the big thing this year when Trayvon Walker was being drafted number 1 overall by the Jacksonville Jaguars was they didn't ask him to do a lot of, like they didn't ask him to pin his ears back a lot, right? He was kind of a contain rusher. He was kind of this, that, and the other thing. Like, because analytically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and look at what are called true pass sets. And you can look back at Pro Football Focus. I wrote an article about this, before, basically taking out screens, taking out, play action plays, taking out plays where a guy's double team. When you're a scout, do you do that contextualize? Like, do you watch the plays where he's not sort of supposed to be a pass rusher, or do you watch all the plays and kind of see? Because there are some plays I can imagine where I'm going to miss as an analytics guy because there's play action, for example, and he's got to hold the point of attack with a tight end, right? And then he's got to be explosive 2 seconds into the down, right? And that's something that as a scout, you can see and analytically, unless I'm hard coding that into my systems, I'm not really seeing.
To your point, there's no question you look on the backside of the play or when they're not necessarily involved in the point of attack moment. Of course, that's really, really important. But that explosiveness, as you just mentioned, can come when they're at the point of attack, when they're getting up on the left tackle to the quarterback, or on the backside. Just mentioned, they're playing off the blocks. They may even drop and get to a situation where they have to show explosiveness in a different way, coming out of a break, coming up to support a certain way. So let me just say I say explosiveness. I'm a big believer in athleticism, pure, natural, explosive reactionary athleticism as a defender. The ability to, again, stop, start, explode out of many, many different elements and many different situations where your body is sort of turned in an off way. To be able to be explosive in that area is really, really big. Now, there are DNs out there, pass rush guys, who are a little bit more methodical, right? They set things up a little bit, and they lull you to sleep a little bit, where you really have to dig in and see at the core what their athleticism, explosiveness is. And that sometimes is not always on the field. We want it to be on the field, Eric, right? Sometimes it has to do with really digging on the drills when we have them out on the practice field, when we're working them out, or when we're at the pro days, or when we're at the combine, and we can really, truly determine their explosiveness. I love to come back to on the field stuff, of course, but you're very correct. Anytime they're on the field, I think you can see explosiveness at different levels.
Yeah, and it's what's really interesting is like I think analytics has been able to measure this fairly well. Like, one of my friends, Justice Mosqueda, he sort of looked at, kind of, you look at broad jump, you look at vertical jump, you look at 40, and one of the cone drills, you can really like edge. One of the reasons I said edge is one of the easier positions to evaluate is like those things correlate with on-field production more than they do for most positions. But what's really interesting now, though, is that, and we don't quite have it here. I know some vendors, like telemetry and StatsBomb are collecting college tracking data. Like one of the things we can do, which I think is gonna blend scouting with analytics so well, is like we can measure some of those things, right? We can look and say in the first second of a play, how much ground does this guy cover? And what I found, and I published this paper at Sloan this spring, is like that number correlates really well with 40-yard dash, or correlates really well with 3-cone and broad jump. Like you can measure explosiveness on the field, and you can even contextualize it to what you're saying, which is like whistle to whistle, right? And what I even like more is expound for me for a second. When you look at a guy, like Vic Beasley, like he played in the ACC, right? He's playing against great players. You don't really have to calibrate that. But if you're taking a pass rusher, like I think like Hugh Douglas played for Southern, right? Like, and how when a guy plays for an FCS school, how do you calibrate? Well, you can calibrate that with tracking data maybe a little bit better than you can if you're just watching film, because again, the game is a little slower, but it may be harder for our naked eye to detect. So that's one place where I think there's a lot of things that traditional scouting can detect that the analytics can't. And maybe that's one thing where the analytics can detect it, and maybe traditional scouting will have a harder time when it's something like, what kind of competition is the guy playing? Is the left tackle able to get to 2 yards deep on his kick step so that this guy has a real rep against him or not? I think those are things that analytics can measure maybe a little bit better than traditional scouting, even though there are other things, namely when the play breaks down that traditional scouting can discern.
Well, it's a really good point. And I think you're right. I think this is a situation on the projection side that can be really beneficial as we're honing in on the data that, that maybe a company like SumerSports, not maybe, like a company like SumerSports can provide, right? It provides the augmentation to the very good talent evaluator, right? So projection, just so everyone knows, projection has always been a really, really important part of an evaluator's prowess. If you're a guy that has an eye on athleticism and movement and this and that at so many levels, at whatever position we're talking about, but you don't have an adeptness per, like the idea of projecting from a Division II to a big time school, or even projecting, of course, into eventually the pro game, then you're really lacking. And it's an acquired talent. It's not something you can do right out the gate as a 21-year-old evaluator. It's something that takes time. We talk all the time about the best evaluators in the league or on a particular staff. And it's not always the oldest guys, because some of those older guys just never had a grasp of it. But it oftentimes is someone that has a really good track record and experiences 10, 12, 15 plus years, who can project, use their historical projection to add that to their ability to truly evaluate the movement, the explosiveness, all the traits, all the metrics that you're evaluating. And then you have that complete scout. And we're closest to, where we think we are pretty damn effective as being evaluators. But again, that said, sorry, yes.
You bring up so you said projection, which I think is cool because it obviously has a meaning for you, which is to say, take something that's happened over here and map it to something that you want, right? And in math, projection essentially means you're taking we will call them vectors, but you call it like a data set, right? And you take those components and you weigh them and you weigh them to get the best sort of I'm using the same word to define it, but projection over there. And so you think about this, when I'm looking at kind of what I'm supposed to do, I'll take all this data, this play-by-play data, for example, and I will say, okay, let's look at, for one, what predicts what. So I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that like pressure rates. So like how often do you get a pressure? And again, there's a number of different ways. ESPN has a way to do it with tracking data. Pro Football Focus charts it manually. I think Sports Info Solution does as well. But pressure data, how frequently you get pressure is better able to predict how often you get sacks more than how often you get sacks in college predicts how well you get sacked. So it's sort of this process versus result. So, and that is, has been able to uncover some hidden gems before. Like Brandon Graham yesterday for the Eagles, he got 3 sacks. His career has historically been one where he got a lot of pressures but wasn't able to finish. And like part of the evaluation process is saying, okay, well, actually, he's undervalued because this pressure rate would theoretically mean this sack rate in the future, but his sack rate's actually a little lower. So people are going to undervalue him in the markets. And like that's part of like what the whole mathematical part of it is, to look at, okay, let's find data that has hidden meaning and hidden value in projecting the things that we want. And we all know that the GMs of the world, they pay for sacks, right? But pressures are what create sacks.
So let me add, I have a few things here. So I said explosiveness off the mark, right? So think about explosiveness. We're talking about snap to whistle explosiveness, the acceleration off the ball, the ability to bend around the corner. Your moves with your hands are so many. Your repertoire with your hands is a really, really important part. Again, bending around the corner. We call it bend to the quarterback, whatever it may be. The acceleration, the burst and acceleration out of your bend, which is a big thing. Your body control to get down low. You've seen some of those special ones, Eric, where they're literally touching the ground. And then, of course, the acceleration and the finish and such. Let me just add this. So I just wanted to paint that picture because all of that can be, to the eye of an evaluator, you realize the nuance of what that D end is, right? Smooth, explosive, athletic, fast, strong. What I also want to add is we add speed to power, which is a really, really important part. Back to your point of pressuring. You get someone who gets off the ball like that, and that speed is rolling. All of a sudden, it's speed, and then all of a sudden he bull rushes someone. And I'm talking about as an outside pass rusher too. I'm not just talking about the big hosses inside. Speed to power element is a really, really cool aspect when you look at some of the top-notch guys. All of that looks good when you're looking at it as an evaluator, right? You're grading these guys really, really high, and hopefully they're regular with their pressures. Now take that individual versus the individual that doesn't have all the traits that I was just trying to describe. Maybe a little bit slower off the ball, lethargic in his moves, can't really bend, stiff. We call them plotters, and their hand fighting is okay. They're nothing. There's nothing special. They're not really overly quick with their hands. You don't see a big burst to the quarterback when you're finishing, and yet statistically they may come out very high. What I used to slam into our scouts, especially as they were coming up young. Do not come to me and tell me about all and everything this DN does when he's going against some of these slap asses as tackles that they may be going against. Yeah. I mean, there are tackles out there that are really good, that give you a good gauge of what a DN is. There are others out there that are missing with their hands. They're up erect guys. They have no sink in their hips. They can't work their hands. Their vision is off. They're olaying people. So when I used to go back, when guys would put together at least 10 and 15 play shots on a DN to show me like, this is a guy we really, really want. And we would look at the opposition, and it would be amazing to see of those 9 or 10 shots or 11 or 12 that he got towards the quarterback or pressured the quarterback, that there were many that folded in the inadequacies of the offensive tackle. Let me take back. I don't want to say slap ass. That's my own excitement.
No, you're good. But I actually, that brings up a great question. By the way, for those of you that have come in a little bit late, this is the episode 11 of the SumerSports Show. Thomas and I are talking about edge evaluation from my perspective with analytics. His was scouting. We thank you all for being here. This is, I think so far been great. I want to ask you a question though, because there's two types of players you just outlined, right? There's the guy, and I'm a Kansas City fan. George Karlaftis feels like the second kind, right? Where he's very productive, right? And a guy like me is going to look at, hey, look at his pressure rate, look at his pressure rate, look at his pressure rate. And somebody who evaluates films can be like, well, he's a little stiff, and that's probably why he didn't get taken in the top 10 picks. He got taken in the bottom half of the first round. Yeah. And then there's And then there's maybe a player who kind of, I think of like, this was your first draft, Derek Hardy, right? Where he's got all the talent, right? All the ability in the world, but he isn't that productive, right?
Right.
Is there one that's better or are both bad, right? Because I think after about pick 12, Thomas, you're not going to get a guy who has all the traits who's also college productive. That guy's being picked in the top 10, right? Like, and so of those two types of extremes, like which one gets favored in the NFL right now?
Okay, so the ones that get favored in the NFL, no question, are that pretty athlete that there's a shiny element to it, right? Where you're like, wow, the upside of this cat, if we can really work with him, get him with the right DN coach, put him in the right system, he's gonna go to levels that we can't even imagine. Versus, the other guy who's good at a lot of things, not excellent at a lot of things, right? There's a differentiation there. That more sort of a little bit overachieving. It's not really that, but a little bit more plodding, a little bit less smooth in their movement and explosive, but produce like crazy. There are a lot of those guys over the years who have done really, really good jobs, right? They may not have had 15 or 20 sacks, but they've been very productive in the 9 to 12 sacks. I mean, and for year in and year out, really, really consistent people, right? So I think you have to look at who your coach is. I'll come back to Dan Quinn. Dan came to us in Atlanta from Seattle, from a very explosive, athletic, just everything was fast, speedy, and explosive, right?
Yep.
So he and I, when we were looking at individuals to be on our pass rush side and to be a really important part, a lot of that had to do with the athleticism, the explosiveness that I appreciated as well. Don't get me wrong. But and I mentioned at the outset, he and I picked two guys that are really, really athletic and really talented. But we never got out of them what we needed in Vic Beasley and Tack McKinley.
Yeah.
Versus, let me just say this. You can take a guy, if you truly took those two guys, Vic Beasley and or Tack McKinley, and you put them side by side, and this is going to sound almost like heresy, but I'm not meaning it because he's really, really, really good, is TJ Watt. TJ wasn't the same type of explosiveness off the ball like these two guys were, right? Just pure natural body control. However, very, very productive and obviously a Pro Bowl type of player, right? So in the end, you can get lulled a little bit by those guys that don't come across looking like that elite athlete out there. And you can get that kind of good moving guy. That's the only way I can describe it. Yeah. And all of a sudden that person ends up excelling year in and year out. And you take that.
Well, and I think this is a great question by Darius, because I think it hits on what you're saying, which is, what about somebody like Leonard Floyd, who, and I think I would shudder to call him bad, but he's had different successes, different places. Is that a development thing? I think it partially is development. And we talked about that with Jack on Wednesday, but I think it's also something where analytics can help out. So and I know that this is part of, we've worked together before, and this is, I know that this is how you think as well, but pass rushers, they do things differently depending upon where they are, right? So some guys can rush from the left and the right equally well. Some guys can rush from the interior well, some guys like George Kalafdis, the Chiefs started putting him over the center, and he's been very productive, right? Now that takes away from some of his value because you never want him over the center on real downs, but on passing downs, he can be effective there. And what I think is interesting, and this is where data can help you, is we can subset that data. So what I used to do at PFF is I used to look and say, okay, how did he do as a left edge? How did he do as a right edge? How did he do as an interior rusher? How did he do when the other team ran play action? How did he do when the other team was in a designated 3rd and 5 or longer passing situation? When everybody knew he had to rush the passer, how did he do? And from there, now some of that data is a little noisy, right? If a guy only has 50 pass rushing snaps from the interior, you're going to draw big error bars around that projection. But then what you can do is you can go and simulate and say, okay, I'm going to put him on the Tennessee Titans, and we're going to have him be a 50% DPR. He's only going to play 50% of his downs on 1st and 2nd down, and look and see what it is. His production commensurate with his salary? And you can do that. Now you can do that for every position. Edge is an easier one because I can say, look, like Frank Clark's the one, he plays for the Chiefs, and they pay him $100 million, traded 2 picks for him. But if you just made Frank a designated pass rusher, his pass rush numbers would look pretty good. It's the question of are you paying for that, right? And so forth. I think math can help you do that. You can do that calculus in your brain, which is to say he's going to play in this system, doing this kind of stuff, and he can be productive here, even though historically he hasn't been. If you ask him to be this kind of defensive end.
So this is great because it allows us to take that player that we're looking at, let's just stay in the spirit of this, of the 8 athlete being the excellent athlete and the 6 athlete being the good athlete, right? Differentiate that way for a minute.
Yep.
The 8 athlete or the excellent athlete, you're not worried about that as you continue to evaluate and massage your draft board on where that player is, right? Well, let's just stay on the college side for a minute. You in the back of your mind, you're still a little bit worried about that 6 athlete who ran a 4.87 versus that elite athlete who ran a 4.55, right? You're not concerned about that. You're still in the back of your mind saying, all of my life in scouting and many years, for decades and decades, as long as scouting was a thing, of course, we used to be taught, and this isn't, I'm not saying I was around that long, of course, we used to be taught, make a mistake on speed and athleticism, right? So if you're worried about that 6 athlete who is an adequate speed guy, an adequate athlete, adequate explosive guy, and yet he has sacks coming out of his ears, even compared to the really athletic, top-notch upside guy that you're projecting, right? You're like, yeah, but the potential. And by the way, another adage, don't F it up on potential, because you can project and say, I love this guy. He's got the potential to be. Too many of us have had our hands on our rears after we've picked someone like that, and they haven't reached their potential. And all of a sudden, this 6 athlete over here, who's not the shining star, he ends up consistently winning. What I want to say to you quickly is that idea of taking that athlete, the 6 athlete, and saying, okay, I'm concerned about his lack of explosiveness and smoothness around the corner, and maybe when he really gets with elite talent, he won't be able to deal with those tackles. And then you start digging in to see where his production has come. Not just the schools, but how can we truly do that against, the people that we're evaluating? Again, back to that, evaluate the opponent, because you might have that 6 athlete who has, 55 sacks. And if you really dig in, of those 55 sacks, he only had 10 against guys that we considered top-notch guys themselves and their teams, right?
Yeah, for sure. And this is interesting because, for example, Jermaine Johnson was picked in the first round this year by the Jets, and he has a lot of great traits, right? He was absolutely amazing at the Senior Bowl, which we can talk about that at some point too. But 25% of his pressures came against Jacksonville State last year, and you're just like, okay, so we have to grade his production on a curve, along with obviously him as an athlete and stuff like that. I think that's a really good sort of omen there. Yeah, I think it's so interesting, right? And the other part is how do these players complement with each other, right? So when you're evaluating a player, and let's say you're in a well-established group, so you were on the Patriots forever, and you had Mike Vrabel, you had Vince Wilfork, Ty Warren, Jarvis Green, guys who were really good, played their role really well. Were you able to say, okay, he might not be able to do this, but I got 3 other guys on my team who can do that, and so I'm gonna value a little bit the fact that he can do something else that will complement, because we talked about the Rams last week a little bit with how Les Snead trades all of his first round picks, but the guys that he gets in the later rounds you're not getting complete athletes there, right? I think that's the name of the story, is that when you're taking guys after rounds 1 or 2, they all have incompletions to them, right? And so it's what incompletions are you willing to deal with? And for pass rushers, I think that's the tricky thing, because if a guy is going to get taken later, he's either a great athlete who wasn't that productive or had some off-field stuff, or he's a 6 athlete, to your point, who's productive. And I guess your question in that sense is, can his productivity meld with the current players on my roster? And is turnover in the NFL so too heavy to think that way?
Wow, there's a lot there. Let me first start by saying there's no question in my mind those players that how do I put this? Those players that are, you think they're going to be in the right situation to complement what you have on your team. but you're not really sure. I would say too often in this game, not too often, maybe many more times than we want to admit, some of the people don't know exactly what they have on their rosters, right? It's one of the things that most people drill into their scouting unit and their coaching side is know your people better than anyone, because it allows you not only to project who's going to come in and overtake the position, because you can in an educated fashion compare. One of the things I learned from Bill Belichick early on and Scott Pioli when we were together in New England early on is don't even come to me and talk to me about a player if you can't compare him to our safety or our DN or our pass rush guy or our D tackle. And not only compare he's better than, but have a really firm grasp of how they do compare. And in that, you would be able to project how they would complement each other. But a very, very good point. If you're a team builder, a GM, and this has happened, I've been around organizations before, indirectly and directly, who don't stress that their scouts aren't out evaluating their own talent. And if you don't have a grasp of your own team, it is very, very tough in a full circle, the entire group to put your evaluations together and do the right job in evaluating the total picture, which is a very, very important part, I think, as you're building a team, of course.
Yeah. So, well, and to your point, I think when we've talked, in the past, like when I always think like whenever I've been wrong about a player, and I think, I've been, I've had my misses and certainly, I think edge, I've missed less than other positions because, like I said, I think it's easier. But whenever I've missed on a player, it's always been something like, well, the coaches, it was something, it was just like he didn't mesh with the system, or, and the other one, and we can talk about this briefly, is the other one was just like the guy didn't have it mentally, right? And I think edge is maybe a little bit, not to degrade the position, but like edge is one of those positions where it's a little less, there's a little less scheme associated with it. It's very much a put your hand in the grass and be a track athlete a few times a game. And then, but there is scheme to it, right? Every single time I've missed, it's not necessarily been for the production or the physicality. It's been more of like, he doesn't fit in this scheme. He doesn't do what they ask him to do very well, or he doesn't understand the game very well. And those are things, by the way, Thomas, where, when I talk about my analytics, or our analytics, right? Like, obviously we'd like to have that information in our data. Mm-hmm. At Pro Football Focus, I didn't have it. Obviously you guys had it in Atlanta. Would, put a ballpark figure on it. What percentage of that like non play-by-play data analytical thing can you put on a player? It's got to be in the 30 to 50%, isn't it?
I was going to say 28%, maybe. Yeah, okay. Maybe that's where my head was going. But it's a very, very good point. And I would say most of the people that are in this job now, back to SumerSports and where we're going, why we're in this business as it is, because, and we've said it a number of times, you can miss on people and you can hit on people, of course, but it's putting the entire roster together, which is really, really important. And being able to take that, again, that evaluator that has a really good grasp of all things evaluation, and being able to take everything that you might offer from an analytic standpoint and with us, and really detailed and cutting edge algorithmic approach. To me, I think there's no better way to do that. If I am a GM today, and I am in the middle of building and thinking about free agency and the draft coming up, and I realize that there is a product out there that's going to help augment my skills, truly, if I'm being honest with all of us, there are some really good evaluators in the GM positions. It's not just about evaluating. Of course, it's about choices being made at so many levels. But I'm going to tell you, the most of the time, the reason that those GMs get to the GM role, besides the odd guys like Howie Roseman and Mickey Loomis and some guys like that who are, and now Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, who are really, really good football people. They've developed into really good team builders. Their background wasn't scouting. A lot of these guys can scout out their ears, but there are other things that come into play, of course, which I believe a company like SumerSports can really come into the picture and help them with so many of the decision making beyond just the pure evaluation.
Yeah, and what I think is really cool is like, I talk about some stuff for pass rushers, right? And like during the course of my career, it was just play by like when I wrote, the whole hey, pressures predict sacks better than sacks do. Bill James of baseball fame was like, hey, this is really cool. And now if like you did that analysis, it would be kind of behind the times. Now you got to really take tracking data. You really have to use that to augment what you're looking at. And I feel like with scouting, it's similar, right? Like, because, back in the day, like if you being an edge defender was a different role than it is now to a certain extent. And so as mathematicians like me have to evolve, evaluators have to evolve. And I think that evolution is going to be quicker for both groups if we weigh the outcomes of both processes as a part of the evaluation process. And so I think that, and what we're trying to do here at Sumer, also what we're trying to do with this podcast, I think is a really, solid, I think, path towards that. So I know that we promised the listeners a shorter Monday pod. So we're going to move on here. That was really fun, Thomas, by the way. I just love talking football with you because honestly, like there's so much when you're, you feel like me as a mathematician, I'm like that meme where the guy's like, he's holding the tail of the elephant. He's like, oh, that's a rope. And then he hit, and he has the leg and he's like, oh, that's a tree trunk. And I think over hopefully the course of the show, we'll start to see the whole elephant of player evaluation. So let's talk. I know there's a game tonight and, let's be honest, people want to talk about football and the games that are going to happen. Now, we're not going to give out betting advice. We know New England's about a 2.5-point favorite. That has moved. There's been money on New England. Totals in the low 40s. Cardinals are interestingly mathematically one of the most unique schemes in all of football, but it hasn't really translated to success so far. The Patriots, this is a guy, by the way, where I feel like I'm right. I like Ramondre Stevenson coming out of Oklahoma. I remember messaging a few people in the league, and they were all kind of like, oh, he's got short arms. He's not that fast. Your former or your current friend, but former boss in New England, Bill Belichick, drafts him. He's amazing. This is a game where I think Ramondre Stevenson has a big game. The Cardinals are giving up the shortest passes in the league, but the most yards after the catch in football. And I think that obviously that plays right into the matchup there with Ramondre Stevenson. But we wanted to talk about one player to watch in each game. Thomas, do you want to start with your player?
No, I think you should start with yours because you got me excited a little bit about this. Before we move on here, when you start talking about Bill Belichick, being the general manager there, the 53 in charge, he's the in charge guy, and you start talking about Steve Keim, right, who's in charge at Arizona. Very, very. I just want to add this little bit of insight because you're the one that does a really good job like matching the games, and I know you want to talk a little bit of lines and gambling, but that's not our shtick here. If I can quickly, they're both coming to the table really interesting, right? The organizations and their head dudes in charge with a lot on their plate, right? Yeah. I mean, where New England is right now, and interject, please. What's the percentage chance that they could squeak into the back end of the playoffs, by the way?
Yeah, you're at about 25%, right? Like I think that's what 538 had him. I'm assuming Pro Football Focus, Football Outsiders have it the same. The thing that they have going for them is that the Jets have lost 2 games in a row. The Jets went 0-2 against the Patriots. So if they were ever to meet, have a tiebreaker, 2-on-2 tiebreaker, they would beat a team, that played. The downside though is that the Chargers, who were 6-6, much like the Patriots won a game they weren't supposed to win against Miami last night as underdogs. Justin Herbert was wonderful there. So the Chargers are currently in that 7th position. And so New England would have to leapfrog them. I do not believe they play this year. I could be wrong. I got to look back at the schedule, but that's one in their way. But yeah, if New England gets hot here, like they could make the playoffs, and it would be, of course, the second time in 2 years under Mac Jones that the Patriots have made the playoffs, which would be a good feat. Also, obviously, the Dolphins losing was also big because that's another team that could, because they have a hard schedule, fall off, and New England could surpass them in the standings. So I'm really excited about that. The Cardinals were a team last year. They won 11 games, almost won the division. Their season win total was 8.5. So I think people were looking at last year's team They won a lot of games as underdogs, etc. I think a lot of people looked at that last year's team as a little lucky, right? So they set the win total 8.5. It's a tough transition for them, right? Because they just started to pay their quarterback a lot of money, which, he's got to learn how to be a quarterback of a team without all the weapons because you're paying him all the money. And I think there's a transition there for Arizona.
But so if I might, those are great comments, and thanks for helping me with that. When I was talking about Bill and I was talking about like that, to me is fascinating to step back after you're watching the godfather of all of football, the very best head coach in the history of this game, in my opinion, everything he does at every level, right? Being faced with this situation of potentially not making the playoffs, that's a really complicated thing for not only him, of course, but for the organization, how they approach everything. You can only imagine. You can imagine the elements of just natural tension within that building, right? Because you are so used to winning all the time. I talked to Nick Caserio a couple of years ago, right when he got to Houston, and I said, Nick, how you led as the next in line to Bill at New England is going to be very different how you lead when you're at Houston, because what we grew up with in New England with all of those wins, my God, it's unbelievable, unfathomable. That year I left in 2007-8, when we get to the Super Bowl, of course, and we lose to the Giants. That year was unbelievable. We won so much by so many points. You kind of get addicted to that. So my point is, when that organization is so used to winning all the time, every time, in so many different ways, literally and figuratively, it's complicated. Flip it over to Steve Keim right now, who I have a great deal of respect. I think Steve is one of the best evaluators. I want everyone to know that. You can throw darts at any of the GMs you want, and people are going to have their hot seat dart throwing at Steve for a number of reasons, just because he is really, really talented at that. And he's in a situation where he's got a really uneasy situation with a quarterback, right? I mean, he doesn't per se, not necessarily himself, but in the end, if there is the upheaval that's going on, at least from how we understand it, as a GM, you don't think you go to bed every night and go back to your home every night completely stressed out over that. You're damn right you do, because that's your lifeline. And I think it's fascinating when you're bringing two teams together that have so much on the line, and you all might from afar thinking, what, 4-5, and what are the two records? 4.
Yeah, so the Patriots are 6-6, and the Cardinals are 4-8.
4-8. Excuse me, 4-5, 4-8. Those are, you think, whatever. No, man, there is a lot going on there. A lot of deep contemplation on where the organization is going from here. And again, hot seats are there all the time. I'm not saying for Bill. I don't know if they're ever hot for Bill, to be honest with you. But for those that are more my contemporaries in the league, there's a lot of hot seat that you have to deal with, and you hopefully pull through. I know I got off on, my guy was going to be Zach Allen, by the way. I want to talk about him a little bit, but why don't we toss it over to you after my guy?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for me, and this is interesting because we just talked about edge players, and yet because it's New England, I feel like I want to talk about a player who's kind of that hybrid guy, right? Because Bill was, he was with the Giants, right? And we all remember Lawrence Taylor. Lawrence Taylor could do everything, right? And he was probably the best defensive player in the league at the time. And, and New England kind of does that a little bit, right? It was, Adalius Thomas your last year in 2007. It was, Vrabel was kind of that way as well. But then you had Kyle Van Noy, you had guys like that. They drafted this gentleman out of Michigan named Josh Uche a couple of years ago. He was a second-round pick. What's really interesting is, again, it brings up a lot of these questions, right? He only played about 600 snaps his entire time at Michigan. About 450 of them were in his final year. He was able to get pressure on 22% of his snaps, which is a really high rate. Now, he's gotten pressure on 19% of his snaps now that he's come to New England, and again, in more of a hybrid role as well. But Uche's an interesting character, right? 6'1", 245 pounds. So when you think about coming off of the edge, and again, he's not a pure edge player. He's kind of a hybrid guy. But when you talk about coming off of the edge, he doesn't have the measurables, right? 18 bench presses at the combine, and then he didn't test the rest of the time. And it was the COVID year, so we didn't really have a pro day on him either. So you had to almost completely go off of scouting for him because he had limited reps at Michigan, and the reps were in kind of DPR sort of situations. and you didn't have athleticism data on him. And so for me, the fact that Belichick could take a guy like this, and the question I want to ask you is, how many other organizations does he have success with? Is maybe a great question, because maybe that answers not that many, and it's just a Bill Belichick type of success story. Or was there something hidden in him? Because I know, he was still a prospect when you were still a Falcons GM. So I just have so many questions about him, because I think he's such an interesting case study.
He's an interesting case study, and Bill is magical that way. Whether you have the non-Bill fans or the non-Patriot fans, and you don't want to hear this, you didn't want to hear it about Tom Brady, of course. I get that, from anyone coming out of the Patriot paradigm, but he's special. And I've mentioned this before. He'll take the 3 or 4 things and know that this certain player may not, again, contribute the 8 things that you really want in the true, sort of Mac Daddy rusher or DN. But he knows that can just supplement his defense as well as it can, and he'll work those. It's like, honestly, it's like the when you think about the martial artists out there, Bruce Lee, right? He was unbelievable at so many levels, but he had the best roundhouse kick ever in the history of the world, period. And he kept working on that, right? He kept working on what he knew no one could really stop. Anyway, without talking about the history of martial arts, I do think that Bill has that understanding, and he has an understanding at a lot of levels, of course. But I mean, to tap into those players and get the most out of the players on the requisite needs, that is a big deal. Some people can't do it. They go in. Some coaches are all over the place, whimsical. They look at a player and they're thinking, okay, if they're not everything, then they're nothing. And it's such a bad approach to utilizing your talent when you approach it.
And it's also a good lesson for business, right? I think like what you want, you get paid big bucks to be a coach or a GM or a manager of a business, to be able to create a steady environment for the people who work for you to have success, right? And if you're constantly changing what the job description is for a player, I can't imagine that's healthy for a young player. And so what I think's cool about Belichick, and again, like I would say, given the bad luck they've had in the draft, and as well as like what they're dealing with at quarterback and the fact they lost both coordinators recently and et cetera, like I think the Patriots are doing fine relative to expectations. I think we have to be careful, because the Patriots have won 6 Super Bowls, and that's the expectation most of the time. But when you look at, you lose the best player to ever play in the NFL, and you kind of have to think about, okay, like the fact that the Josh Ushis exists, or J.C. Jackson, right? He gets a huge contract. He goes and leaves. Cole Strange was a guy we all thought was overdrafted. He's one of the best guards in football right now. Like, I think when you look and say, okay, Bill is providing a constant job description for these players, and they're thriving, many of them, that's a good thing. And that's something where, again, I put in the tag of this podcast, leadership and business. Like, there's also an aspect of leadership and business here where it goes beyond football, where if you give people, consistent environments in which to work, that's really where you generate creativity and also, productivity. So I just think that that's a good feather in the cap of Belichick here.
It is. And when you start talking about the importance of having a head coach and a general manager relationship, clear communication, whoever is in charge, right? Could be the head coach, of course. And we know some who are really, really successful, of course, Bill and Andy Reid and Pete Carroll, how they do things. The interesting thing right now, and we've talked about this a little bit, that group is fallen by the wayside, meaning not them themselves, but there's not a next wave of all of those like full on power broker head coaches right now, right? They're in between in the time they've put in. There are some great coaches, don't get me wrong, out there. They may not be ready, or nor may they want to approach it like that generation of coach did. This is a really fascinating topic that we can talk about another time, and I would love to, because when you're a general manager or an ownership looking to bring in your next head coach, we're right around the corner to doing some of that, so maybe we save it for another episode. There is unbelievable. There are many layers to discuss on this topic.
Let's leave that to Wednesday. Let's talk about kind of, because we briefly touched on it Wednesday with the Titans, and kind of maybe there's an evolution there. But for the most part, and I mean, not to give away the game a little bit, but I kind of agree with coaches who want, in the early part of their career just to coach, because I mean, as you know, as somebody who sat in the chair, that's not an easy job to do in and of itself, let alone while you're trying to coach men every Sunday and trying to keep the train on the tracks.
We've had this conversation a lot, and I won't beat it to death. When you're a GM and you're hiring someone, yes, you would love them to come in and get their feet on the ground, head above water for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Maybe on the second contract, you're much more open as a general manager to say, hey man, you want final 53? I'm willing to do that. You've proven that you're capable of doing what you're doing and you're thriving in it. Let's make that move. If you believe, head coach, that it's important to take your team to another level and you need that, then let's discuss it. Coming out the gate, giving that to a head coach, young head coaches, can be complicated. And there are some really good ones who have done really good work with that. But there have been also others that have gotten that coming out of the gate, and within 2 or 3 years are like, man, all I want to do is coach this team. I don't want to worry about all the nonsense.
Yeah.
So,
for sure. And it's always harder, right? By the way, this is a lesson to everybody. You can chase all the responsibility in the world. It's harder than to go back and say, hey, I want to do less. So be careful about what you end up committing to, because again, like there's, grow into things and understand that how difficult and how widespread those things can be. So Zach Allen's your player for tonight?
Yeah, Zach Allen's my player for tonight, but I think we don't have time to talk. Only reason I want to bring it up is the last thing is, as I was talking earlier about that elite 8 athlete versus the 6 athlete, and watching some of these guys that I've missed on in the past at a number of levels who weren't, again, the shiny, smooth flowing athlete that we all want, because we have such a need. I've made my mistakes in the past, and I guarantee every GM in this league over the history of this league have made their mistakes many times on over needing, so to speak. Like they had such a need to get up and around the corner to the quarterback that they saw this athlete that would take them to the promised land. And again, too many times it doesn't happen. We pass up this really good, consistent player that can be there for many contracts and not just one, of course.
Yeah, and that's obviously a cautionary tale. I will give you, though, back up a little bit. You did get Grady Jarrett in the 5th round, who is still a very good football player. So, that there's been, I think, we all remember our misses, but our hits, it's sometimes good to go back to. So, by the way, this has been episode 11 of the SumerSports Show. Everybody that followed along with us live, thank you very much. Thank you for the great questions. We'll continue to do this. We're planning again on Monday and Wednesday now. Wednesday is going to be sort of more of what it's been in the past. Monday is going to be what we did today, which is, deep dive on a position from a scouting and an analytics perspective. So we really do appreciate you guys. Come listen to us on all your podcast platforms. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 11 of the SumerSports Show.